maximum plastic input into the world's oceans from some of the biggest rivers. And what the shading shows us is when their peak rainfall is. And what you can see is plastic input is typically during the rainy season. What can we do as people? Well, this graph, this map, basically shows you per capita emissions in 2019. So this is how much CO2 was emitted per country according to the number of people, so by individual person. And as you can see, developed countries are predominantly responsible for the most CO2 emissions on a per capita basis. And CO2 emissions come from fossil fuels. In Australia, what you can see is the majority of our CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, come from coal, oil, and gas. So again, fossil fuels. So what we really need to do to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions is to stop using fossil fuels. We need to capture our CO2 and store it, and we need to be able to build a bridge to the next century so we can allow our planet to recover. So in Australia, like India, we have vast amounts of sunlight. So solar panels are an obvious solution. Wind power is an obvious solution. There's so many technological solutions out there, and India is part of the answer to this. We really need to be thinking about smart technology to bring us into the future. But blue carbon is also something many people haven't heard about. Coastal wetland ecosystems, for example, mangroves, seagrasses, salt marshes, store vast amounts of carbon. And they actually store this carbon 10 times faster than mature tropical forests on the land. The carbon is stored in the soil for hundreds to thousands of years, and this is because the soil is typically anaerobic. It lacks oxygen. So the carbon decomposes very, very slowly, so it gets locked up. Our coastal wetlands have the capacity to store 3 to 5 times more carbon per equivalent area than tropical forests. And they're storing it in the soil, not above ground. So that means if there's a forest fire, the carbon still stays locked in the soil. Plus, there are wetlands. They're less likely to burn. The problem here, worldwide, we've actually lost around 3/4 of our wetlands since the 1900s. So we really need to be restoring our mangroves and our seagrass beds alongside protecting our coral reefs. I'm going to take a change of tack now and move on to another pollution issue, which I'm sure many of you are more familiar with, and that's plastic pollution. So I'm going to give the audience a moment to think. Who knows why scuba divers always dive with a dive knife? I'll let you have a little think here. So for the scuba divers in the audience, you all know that when you scuba dive, part of your safety equipment is having a dive knife on you at all times. And we don't have a dive knife to battle off sharks. The reason we have to dive with a dive knife with one of those little notches on it, if you can see the little notch, is because the chances are we will at some point swim into a discarded fishing net or a fishing line. And to make sure that we make our way back up to the surface, we need to be able to cut ourselves free or our dive buddy free. So plastic impacts not just wildlife, it impacts us in the water too. So I've been lucky enough to work on some of the world's most remote reefs. This includes Christmas Island and Cocos Keeling in the Indian Ocean, the 2 stars on the left, and One Tree Island on the Great Barrier Reef, which is a research-only station, which means that only small groups of up to 24 researchers are allowed on it at any one time. And what all these remote islands have in common, despite having very low numbers of people living on them is you can walk along the high tide line and there's vast amounts of plastic. Bottle caps, bottle tops, discarded cigarette lighters, flip-flops. I'm sure you've seen similar too. When I dive in the water, I also see plastic. So these images are again from Christmas Island, a small island in the Indian Ocean. And what happens is at certain times of year, southward flowing currents come from the north, moving down around the islands, and they bring plastic from other countries. And as you can see, plastic bags, buckets, bottles, and you just get currents just covering the surface of the water column with this rubbish. And then when you go under the water, you can also see evidence on the reef. The bottom left image is a fishing line that's wrapped around the reef and started to become overgrown. If we move over to the east of Australia, again, One Tree Island, these are the types of plastic we're seeing, and these are some of my students who are studying these plastics. The top right-hand image is a seahorse encased in packing foam. The bottom image is a child's shoe with barnacles on it. And what happens is these plastics enter the ocean somewhere else, and then they raft on the currents, and they can bring barnacles, organisms, pollutants. So they act as a vector, introducing species and pollutants into locations where they haven't been before. One Tree Island in particular is a bird sanctuary. Humans are actually only allowed around from the low tide to the high tide watermark when we walk around the island. The rest of the island is dedicated to birds, but this is what the birds are encountering and feeding on. And it's problematic. It's universally problematic around the world. So where does the plastic pollution come from? As I've said, it comes typically from other locations as it circumnavigates the globe. And logically, and research now backs this up, we now know that most of our plastic pollution comes from densely populated, built-up urban areas where single-use plastics are most commonly used. And the plastic doesn't remain at the place of origin. What happens is it gets used by people. If it's not disposed of correctly or recycled, it then ends up on our land. It then rains and can end up in our waterways and then washes on into the reef and our oceans. And once it's there, it's very hard to remove. Plastic takes a really long time to break down, and the problem is it just breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces that we call microplastics. And nearly every single piece of plastic that we've ever produced is still in existence, apart from the small quantities that we've burnt, which I should add is not a great solution. We know that the plastic is hazardous to marine life. We know that both humans and animals can get tangled in it. It causes injury and drowning, like this turtle on the right that got caught in a fishing line. We know that organisms and pollutants hitch a ride and can be transported around the world. And we have no idea what the long-term consequences of all this plastic in the marine environment is going to be. We're going to be living with the legacy of it for very many generations to come. So if we want to be smart, what are our management solutions? What this map shows us is the round circles are when you get maximum plastic input into the world's oceans from some of the biggest rivers. And what the shading shows us is when their peak rainfall is. And what you can see is plastic input is typically during the rainy season in all of these places. So if you want to get the best bang for your buck, you should really make sure that you pick up the plastics and stop them entering rivers and waterways before the rainy season happens. Where does it go? So again, if we look at these dots, which show us where these are the world's most polluting rivers, and which shows us where they're entering, where the plastics are entering the ocean. But these red dots show you where the plastic typically ends up, or at least the plastic at the surface of the ocean. So these red dots are from ships data, where they're reporting more than 5 pounds of plastic per square mile. So when we think about any kind of pollution, we really, really need an integrated approach. Scientists need to talk with business. Business needs to talk with government. We all need to talk with politicians and decision makers. We need to include this kind of education in our schools. It surprises me how many politicians haven't got a basic scientific background or don't understand the environmental consequences of climate change. And we need to be able to speak to our politicians, tell them what we care about, and take sensible voting decisions. So when we're managing plastic pollution, we need to think from source to sink. We need to know where it's coming from, when it comes, what drives people's behaviour, why they're using single-use plastic. And then we need to come up with alternatives. Are there plastic alternatives? What are our restoration options? How do we clean up this mess and help this planet? So, if my kitchen sink was overflowing and flooding my kitchen floor, before I start mopping up, I'm going to go to the tap and I'm going to turn off the tap. It's completely crazy to keep mopping up the water if I haven't stopped the source of the water. And the same holds true for plastic pollution. We need to turn off the plastic tap and we need a global agreement to close the loop. And there are some great initiatives out there. For example, who's heard of social plastic? This is when plastic from the ocean is reprocessed and used to make new alternative products. So it's recycled and transformed, and then it enters the global supply chain, demonstrating clear environmental, social, and economic impacts. In 2017, the Plastic Bank, and yes, there is a plastic bank, valued plastic waste at 50 cents per kilo. So there's a market for it. You can also get plastic neutral certification for your business. So a little bit like carbon credits, every amount of plastic created, a measured equivalent of plastic is recovered and removed from the environment by an individual or company through recycling, waste management. And you get plastic offset credits. Can you imagine a plastic neutral city, a plastic neutral country, dare I say, a plastic neutral world? It would be fabulous. So what can we do? How do we protect our planet? And how do we help our planet protect us? Well, for many of you, we can make smart choices. I'm going to suggest you think about your children's future and your grandchildren's future. What kind of world do you want them to live in? I'm also going to say, think about yourself. What makes you happy? Get out in nature. Appreciate your green spaces. Plant a tree if you can get involved in a voluntary project or another green project. See what volunteer opportunities are out there. It'll be great for your mind and your health. If you can't get outdoors, why not grow your own herbs? Try not to use single-use plastics. It's actually surprisingly hard. You have to ask people not to give them to you. Try and reduce your carbon footprint. Think about where your food's coming from. How far does it travel? Are you using businesses that are sustainable, that make green choices? Are you choosing environmental holiday options? Are you choosing to do walking meetings to help your colleagues instead of sitting across a table? Why not go for a walk in the park while you discuss what you want to do? Are you supporting local businesses and local farmers? Again, that means you're not paying the carbon credits for things to be flown into you. There's a lot of solutions out there. Did you know that a 5% increase in tree cover can reduce nearby daytime temperatures by 2.3 degrees centigrade in cities? That's amazing. Australia is getting hotter, India is getting hotter, the UK's had bushfires and 40-degree temperatures for the first time ever. We need to be re-greening our world. And India is leading the way in this. Of the 136 tree cities of the world in 2021, Hyderabad and Mumbai were in that list. So there are some really great initiatives that you can get involved with. And if you can't physically do it, support them. Here we see women in Mumbai planting mangrove saplings to protect the local area against rising sea levels. But in addition to that, those mangroves are going to trap carbon dioxide. Mangroves also support juvenile fish, so they're going to support the fisheries in the area. And they're also going to produce shade. So there are so many benefits to re-greening our world.